Have you ever had this conversation? Hey, how's it going? Good, staying busy. Good to hear. Of course you've had this conversation. We've all had this conversation, and we've been on both sides of this conversation many times. Can I tell you something? I hate this conversation. It's one of my biggest pet peeves because I've been busy. And when I'm busy, I feel many things: tired, irritable, frustrated, impatient, wrung out, even anxious. But I can't say I've ever felt good when I'm busy. Why is suddenly busyness a good thing? Maybe I'm doing it wrong, but something tells me I'm not alone in feeling this way when I'm busy. We're in a world that worships work because of all the things that it gives us: power, pleasure, purpose, even prestige. And we find ourselves thinking that if I work harder now, I'll be happier then. Or if I work longer now, I'll be less stressed later. The problem is that when we operate this way, we all too often slip into the pit of workaholism. We're in this Life in Rhythm series where we're discovering a beautiful, healthy, fulfilling life. And what we have seen thus far is that if we want to experience this life, we've got to live in rhythm with God's design for work and family. Over the last several weeks, we have been discovering God's design for work. And it started with the fact that work is a God thing, so we should work like it's a good thing. Then we saw that sin makes our work broken, but the gospel makes our work restorative. Which means, what we talked about last week, we should work as worship, joining God's work through our work. But what happens all too often is instead of working as a way we worship God, we start to worship work. And when we do, we slip into workaholism. Next week, we're going to kick off our discussion about God's design for family, but we can't move there if we're stuck in the pit of workaholism. Now, you may or may not have some workaholic tendencies, so I just want to ask you some questions to help you identify if you may have an unhealthy perspective on work at times. Is it hard for you to say no when someone asks you to do something, even if your schedule is already full? Do you find yourself working on chores, answering email, all the way up until the time when your head hits the pillow at night? And then when you're laying there, you can't fall asleep because your mind is racing with the to-do list items that you have to tackle tomorrow. Before you let your feet hit the floor in the morning, are you already on your phone checking your messages and responding to people who reached out to you overnight? Does a day off make you feel anxious or antsy? Are your only vacation days sick days? When you're off, are you still on? Answering email, thinking about problems that you got to solve at the office? If you answered yes to any of these questions, you might have an unhealthy perspective on work. If you answered yes to many of these questions, you probably have some workaholic tendencies. But God wasn't a workaholic, and we shouldn't be workaholics either. And if we live in rhythm with God's design for work, we won't actually be wrung out, we'll be refreshed. Are you interested? I am. Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 4, where we're going to discover God's rhythm for work and how rest is inserted as part of that rhythm. If you need a Bible, you can, of course, follow along through our Connect Church app, where there's also a place for you to jot down notes during the message. Now, as you're getting to Hebrews, let me kind of provide some context for you. Scholars debate whether different people wrote the book of Hebrews, but one thing everyone agrees upon is this: the author of Hebrews was very familiar with the Israelites' history, and they used the Israelites' history to prove their point. And so that we don't miss the point that the author of Hebrews is going to make today, let me refresh all of our memories on Israel's history. You see, after about 400 years of slavery in Egypt, God frees his people, the Israelites, through a person named Moses. and think Prince of Egypt, right? Now, after God frees the Israelites, he has Moses lead his people all the way up to the brink of the promised land. The land that's going to be refreshing and restful, peaceful, fruitful, a land anyone would want to be a part of. Now, as they're standing on the brink of the promised land, they have just witnessed God part the Red Sea so that they can, escape the Egyptians once and for all. And they're standing on the brink of the promised land, and Moses sends in 12 guys to spy out the land. 10 come back, and they're about ready to wet their pants, fearing imminent failure if they go and try to take the land by their own ability. Then on the other hand, you got these 2 other spies that come back, and they believe that if God has brought them to this, he will get them through this. 10-2. You can guess who won. But in winning, they lost. God would have delivered on his promise. He would have gotten them through and given them this promised land, but they were so wrapped up in their inability to be able to take the land because of the inhabitants of the land. God said, okay, we'll have it your way. And for 40 years, the Israelites wait and wander around in the desert while that generation dies off. It was a blink for God, but it must have felt like an eternity for the Israelites. Now, after the 40 years, God brings them right back to the brink of the promised land again, this time led by a guy named Joshua, Moses' predecessor. And now they stand there, and this time, by God's grace, the Israelites aren't looking at their inability, they're now looking at God's ability, and God leads them into the promised land. A place where they're going to experience rest and refreshment after a long season of restlessness. It's interesting to note here that if we want to enjoy God's rest, it hinges on our belief. Because it's interesting, the Israelites experienced it for themselves. They saw that the consequence of their unbelief was restlessness for the rest of their lives. That's what that generation who wandered around in the desert for 40 years experienced. But then there's this other generation who experiences God's future promise of rest, and it all hinged on their belief. Now, this promise of future rest, it was for the Israelites, but the author of Hebrews points out that this promise of rest in the future, well, the promised land was just foreshadowing a promise that you and I can get in on. And that's what the author of Hebrews wants to point out to us today. And like the Israelites, our ability to realize that rest is going to hinge upon our belief in God's ability. Check it out with me, picking up the story in Hebrews 4, 1-8. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now, we who have believed enter that rest just as God has said. So I declare on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words. On the seventh day, God rested from all his works. And again, in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, would not God have spoken later about another day? This passage is jam-packed with promise for us. So let me do my best to unpack the gift of God's rest for us. At the macro level, the Israelites were invited into the promised land, a place that was luscious and peaceful and fruitful and restful. But that was just foreshadowing a promise for you and me. A future promise that we could one day experience a relationship with God, a relationship that impacts how we live today and gives us hope for tomorrow. The promise of heaven, an eternity in God's presence with Him. Where we're going to be with God in this eternity, in this heavenly place where there's no more crying, there's no more mourning, there's no more pain, there's not even any more death. God will have made that stuff long gone because He is inviting us to this eternal rest with Him. So what was the key to the Israelites experiencing rest in the promised land? And what's the key to us experiencing this eternal rest with God in heaven? Our belief. It's our belief in God's ability over our belief in our ability. Were the ragtag Israelites able to conquer the armies of the land that they were going to take? No. And that's the point. They were unable, but God is able. He was able, He is able, He will always be able. Now, for us, the stakes are so much higher. This isn't just a land we're going to live in here on earth. This is a forever rest with God. So let's do this. Let's take a look at what we can learn from this teachable moment in history so that we don't make the mistake that the first generation of the Israelites made. And instead, like that second generation, let's be a people who trust God's ability over our ability. Because our belief or unbelief is the difference between our rest and restlessness. Let me say that again, because this is what it boils down to. Our belief or unbelief in God's ability is the difference between our future rest or restlessness. On the macro level, are you believing that Jesus is the way to God, or are you playing pick your own religious adventure? Are you banking on Jesus' work to get you in a relationship with God, or are you gambling on the fact that your good works might outweigh your bad works? Are you focused on God's ability to help you realize future rest, or are you really counting on your own ability to make that possible? Rest is God's promise. He promised the Israelites rest, and He's promising us rest today. To unlock it, the key is our belief in God's ability over our ability. Rest is God's promise, and 2, rest is God's rhythm. Check this out in verses 9 and 10. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from His. With this goal of macro rest before us, God infused micro rest into the rhythm of our week. He actually infused it into the created order, like we saw in the beginning of this series. For 6 days, God speaks, something is formed, and then He sits back and sees that it's good. Day after day, this is the pattern of God's creative activity, His work. And then you know what happens on the 7th day? He takes a weekend. Why? Is He tired? No. But He knew you and I would get tired. And God later tells Moses and the Israelites, kind of while they're wandering around in the desert, He tells them that they are to live in a relationship with Him. And one of the ways they express that with their lives is by practicing a Sabbath, a day of rest. And of the 613 rules that God outlines for His people as to what it looks like to live in a relationship with Him, you know what came in at number 4? Practicing the Sabbath. Why would Sabbath come in at number 4? Why does God care so much about our rest? Because God cares about us. And when we rest, it glorifies Him, and it's for our good. Workaholism is trusting our ability over God's ability. We stay late to prove that we're worthy of the promotion, our identity hanging in the balance. We respond right away, no matter the time of day, our acceptance on the line. We are busy always trying to accomplish more and never slowing down because, well, we're scared of what life would look like if we slow down. Maybe we're even worried about our security. But when we infuse rest in our rhythm, when we live God's design for work, we practice relying on God's ability rather than our ability. And it looks like this. We actually would take a day to read, reflect, recharge, because we recognize that we aren't what we produce. That's not where our value comes from. We'll even turn off our phone when we're with friends because we don't have to try to achieve the acceptance of everyone. We know that that's unattainable anyways, and that's all right because God already accepts us for who we are. Well, even when we take vacation time, for some QT with the family, we'll put aside work and we'll enjoy time with the people in front of us, trusting God to move things forward even in our absence. Here's the bottom line. Rest is God's rhythm, so pausing is our practice. Hebrews 4, 10 and 11 say this way. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. As macro rest is a way that we have to trust God to experience, so too, when we practice micro rest, we're flexing our trust muscle, demonstrating our belief in God's ability over our ability. And here, so basically, when we practice that micro rest, we're able to practice trusting God with the small things, which will help us have the faith and the trust and the belief in God for the big things. So here are a couple of ways that we can glorify God and experience His blessing, His goodness in creating rest as part of the rhythm that He wants for us. Here's some ways that we can live this out. 1, pause the production. We're not what we produce. Now, I mean this lovingly, but you're not as important as you think you are. I'm not as important as I think I am. It's a humbling realization, isn't it? In some circles, not taking vacation days is worn as like this badge of honor. And it bums me out because all too often it's those people who end up burning out. We read it just a moment ago. And we should make every effort to do what? Produce? No. Rest. When we rest at the micro level, we're demonstrating our trust in God at the macro level. In 6 days, God created everything, and then He rested. You work incredibly hard at home, at the office, in the yard, out in the classroom, wherever you find yourself working, you work so hard. Pause and enjoy it. And I want to challenge especially those of you who maybe own a business or manage a team. What would it look like for you to institute rest into your organization's rhythm? You're like, Chris, that sounds absurd. I know that sounds crazy, but listen to this. Truett Cathy, when he started Chick-fil-A, he was faced with a challenging decision, and he decided to go the hard way. He said, you know what? I'm going to do what God said. I'm going to have our organization work 6 days a week, and then we're going to rest on the 7th day, thus posing the dilemma that you and I face. Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays. Why is it that I always crave Chick-fil-A on Sundays? When looking at the top 200 list of fast food restaurants, the average revenue per individual location for a fast food restaurant on that top 200 list, you know what it is a year? $700,000 a year. And who's the most recognized fast food chain? McDonald's, of course, right? They've got the golden arches recognized all over the world. And in the industry, they are recognized as the gold standard. And understandably so. In a $700,000 category, the average McDonald's location makes $2.6 million a year in revenue. $2.6 million. I mean, they are the gold standard after all. Now, in a fast food industry like this, where $700,000 is the average revenue for a fast food location, and you got McDonald's making $2.6 million, what do you suppose Chick-fil-A brings in at one of their locations a year? Now, before you make your guess, let me remind you of the tragedy that we all face. They are closed on Sundays. So that is, I'm not great at math, but I believe that's 52 days a year that they are closed when others are open. That's a 52-day handicap. But it actually is more difficult than that. You see, for any given restaurant, Sunday is typically their most profitable day. So we've got Chick-fil-A, who made this decision to honor God as an organization, working 6 days a week and taking the seventh day off. And they're taking off the day that, if you look purely at the numbers, is the best day for restaurants. So we've got this $700,000 category. We've got McDonald's making $2.6 million. What do you suppose Chick-fil-A makes a year with their 52-day handicapped? $7 million. $7 million a year is the average revenue for a Chick-fil-A location. That is 10x the industry standard. Now, Chick-fil-A is a model company for many reasons, but one of their characteristics that's most unique, that really stands in stark contrast to the competition, is they're a 6-day-a-week operation in a 7-day-a-week category. I'm not saying that if you take a day off, you're going to 10x your revenue, but I am saying you might. And here's why. Sabbath is the difference between trusting our ability and trusting God's ability. But more important than your bottom line is your baseline. So pause the production. And 2, Sabbath for your soul. God rested on the seventh day, and He's giving us permission to do the same. He calls the practice Sabbath, and in the original language, Hebrew, that word Sabbath or Shabbat, it has this, it connotes the idea of ceasing or just not doing anything that looks like or resembles work. Now, the idea is that we just don't do anything. That's work. That's like work. Okay, that could be at home, that could be at the office, it could be wherever. But we're not going to work. And instead of, running on empty, we're actually going to take the day to recharge. And we all recharge differently. Some of us recharge alone, others with others. Some inside, some outside. Some sitting, others moving. Personally, I recharge alone, outside, and when I'm active. So personally, a day skiing in the mountains, it's one of the most restful, recharging days for me. It's physically exhausting. But for my mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being, it is so good. This doesn't happen often for me these days in a season with 2 young girls, but even when I get a day just in a normal week, I try to insert each of these elements into my Sabbath. I'll wake up a little early to get some time alone with God before the family wakes up. Amanda graciously lets me exercise at the gym, and then I'll try to get outside with the girls sometime during the day, maybe to go for a walk or play at the park. And through it all, God just recharges me. How do you recharge? What would it look like for you to insert that into your regular rhythm of life? Because rest was God's rhythm, and rest should be our rhythm. And know this, every time we Sabbath, we are proclaiming to God and really those around us that we trust God's ability more than our ability, because we aren't what we do. We're trusting God's ability to keep things moving, even in our absence. As somebody who loves what I get to do, I'll just be honest with you, sometimes it's hard to take a Sabbath. Not because I don't love Sabbaths, just because I love what I get to do at home, at work, pastoring. I mean, it's fun. But I want to be a dad. I want to be a husband. I want to be a pastor for the long haul. So I'm trying my best to follow God's rhythm for work and to rest as part of my week. I would invite you to do the same. Nate, who's on our serve teams here, he has been trying to do the same. He's been trying to follow God's rhythm for work and practice rest. And here's what Nate has he just wrote in a blog that actually you can find on our website or app. And here's what he has come to discover as he's been practicing the rhythm of life that God designed. He says this: rest can come in the middle of our work if we trust that our identities are found through his saving work, not our own. There's an inextricable three-dimensional link between our identity, work, and rest. And God's design points to a symbiotic relationship between these three things. When I discovered that my work flows out of my identity, it's not a path to creating my identity, I no longer despaired when I couldn't finish or get past my work. I found I didn't have to fear rest. I was no longer falling behind by just being for a few moments. What led Nate to this conclusion? Well, I would invite you to check out that blog post on our website or app. For now, know this: rest is God's rhythm, so pausing is our practice. If we live this way, what can we expect? Well, at the macro level, when we trust God's ability over our ability, we can enter eternal rest with him, eternal relationship with him. We recognize that no matter how many good works we do, we can't earn a relationship with God. Sin has already separated us from him, but that's okay because Jesus stands in the gap. And his work actually makes it possible for us to enter a relationship with God. And then at the micro level, when we trust God's ability more than our ability, we'll actually live rested. Instead of depleted, we'll be energized. Our schedule, it won't be oversaturated with appointment after appointment. Instead of anxiety, we'll have peace, trusting that, well, God's got it. And where we were once stressed, we'll now have joy because work is becoming a get to instead of just a have to. And we actually could wake up on Monday morning refreshed rather than depleted. If you ever feel like, God, can I just have a break? Just know this: he's looking back at you and he says, my pleasure.